I'm going to try to be expeditious in my remarks. Frankly, with all due regard to Tony, what he just provided by way of introduction was just a lot of hot air and cliches. There's no systematic analysis. There's no attempt to come to grips with, first of all, what the purpose of free speech is, and secondly, to situate the struggle for free speech within the struggle of the left. The expansion of the boundaries of free speech have been mostly, at least in the United States, I can't speak for the UK, expanding the boundaries of free speech has been mostly a struggle of the left. If you look at the books written on the origins of the First Amendment, what's the word? Eludes me for a moment. The adjudication, the Supreme Court and the First Amendment in the 20th century, it's mostly cases brought by the left, the Communist Party, efforts to suppress leftist organizing, leftist distribution of leaflets and so forth. It's almost the entire history is the history of the left trying to expand the boundaries of free speech. So historically, the two have gone hand in hand. The struggles of the left, the struggle for the expansion of free speech. Even in the American Civil Liberties Union, one of the founders of the American Civil Liberties Union was also one of the founders of the American Communist Party, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Now, there was a lot of hypocrisy there, for sure, by the communists. However, it nonetheless remains the fact that the struggle for free speech has always been a struggle of the left. The struggle to expand the boundaries of speech has always been a struggle of the left. That's the historical context about which a lot can be said, and time doesn't allow me. The word I was looking for was First Amendment jurisprudence. In our own Supreme Court, almost all of the jurisprudence on the right of free speech is about cases brought before the court, before the high court, by people on the left, or people who are being prosecuted on the left. As to its purpose, what is the purpose of free speech? Well, there are two kinds of arguments when it comes to free speech. There's what you might call the natural rights argument. That is, my right to speech is my God-given right, and nobody has the right to restrict what I want to say. As the German folk song puts it, die Gedanken sind frei, thoughts are free, and nobody has the right to restrict or limit my free thought. That argument, it is an argument, but it's not the argument that particularly interests me. For me, the main argument is the argument of the culture of the left. The other night, I was watching a BBC, no, it wasn't BBC, it was a British documentary on Eric Hobsbawm. I guess it aired last year in the UK. I only happened to stumble upon it a few days ago. And in the documentary, at one point, Eric Hobsbawm makes the argument that the left, the Marxist left, and the liberal traditions, they both have a lot of common ground. He calls it basically there was a dialogue between the two, the liberal tradition and the left tradition. And to some extent, I have to say, I didn't agree with him, because people like Karl Marx, for better or for worse, and I think probably for worse, people like Karl Marx were so dismissive of folks like John Stuart Mill, considering him so contemptible and so limited in intellect. I thought it was unfair. So Marx was very hostile to the liberal tradition, at least as it was embodied in people like his own contemporary, John Stuart Mill. But having said that, and there I thought that Hobsbawm was mistaken. Having said that, Hobsbawm is obviously correct that the liberal tradition and the left tradition, they come out of a certain attachment, I'll use the very abstract term, a certain attachment to Enlightenment values, reason, the capacity to persuade through rational argument. That's part of the liberal tradition. It's part of the left tradition. It's unfortunate that it's all been forgotten now, but there's no question when you look at the left tradition, and it was part of the tradition that deeply influenced me, myself, growing up, the extent to which the leftist tradition is deeply rooted in the battle of ideas, reason. If you look at the famous questionnaire when Karl Marx would put questions by his daughter, it was a kind of parlor game. And one of the questions that was put to Karl Marx was, "What's your one vice?" And his response was bookworming. He's always reading, bookworming. When Engels would say, "Come on, Carl, would you finish the goddamn book already?" And he would say, "No, I have to read one more book, and I have to read one more book. I have to read one more book." You go to somebody like Lenin in the midst of the Civil War in the Soviet Union, in the midst of the Civil War, what's he reading? He pulls off from his bookshelf Hegel's Logic. Hegel's Logic he's reading in the middle of the Civil War. When Lenin was once asked about Marx's Capital, he responded, nobody who doesn't understand the whole, and he puts in italics, the whole of Hegel's logic can understand Das Kapital. And I had the good fortune in my youth of having been taught by the leading American Marxist economist, Paul Sweezy. And I still remember vividly in my mind's eye, Sweezy on the stage, and he quoted that remark from Lenin. And he said, "I should hope that's not true, because there are very few people in the world who understand the whole of Hegel's logic." This is not a digression. It's not an excursus. That's the left tradition. Maybe you don't like that tradition. Maybe you think in the age of tweets and Twitter, that tradition is obsolete. But for those who call themselves Marxists or see themselves as part of that tradition, the Marxist tradition, I don't see how you can separate that tradition from the centrality of the struggle of ideas, of reason, of rational persuasion. It was said of Lenin, if he can get you in a room for 3 hours, he can convince you of anything. Yeah, there's very powerful logic. Amusingly enough, in law school, the one subject he got a B in, he got a B in logic, which I find kind of funny. That's the tradition. It's the tradition of Lenin. It's the tradition of Luxembourg. It's the tradition of that whole 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century Marxist tradition. And it certainly was one aspect of the tradition that appealed to me. And I'm not about, in my old age, I'm not about to jettison that tradition in the name of these silly catchphrases about fascism and racism and how we're going to let these people and those people organize, and that these are life and death enemies. They faced life and death enemies back in those days. And when they did impose limits on speech, they did it with a lot of reservation. I don't want to get into the technicalities for your audience, because probably most of them haven't a clue what I'm talking about. But the 10th Party Congress of the Soviet Union, of the Bolshevik Party, when they put limits on the forming of factions, Lenin had to make 1,000 apologies why he was putting limits on the forming of factions. He said it's the middle of the Civil War and this reason and that reason. They were very apologetic about it. And the horrors of the Civil War did not prevent people from, like Rosa Luxemburg, still insisting on the importance of free speech, not because of an abstract value attached to free speech, not because of the I have a right to say what I want, the natural right, but Rosa Luxemburg put it in very practical terms. She said, apart from a few slogans, or the expression she used, apart from a few signposts, she says, none of us even know the first thing about how to build socialism. It's still a complete mist, a mystery, how you go about building this new society. And then in the face of that fact, you have to have freedom of free speech, freedom of debate, in which the best ideas or the best ideas win out, the wrong ideas are defeated. That's the only way you can proceed. You can't build socialism by fiat, because nobody has a blueprint about how to proceed. So, having said all that, where does that leave us? Tony has all of these caveats. I'm not going to let fascists have free speech. Well, okay, all well and good. But who's a fascist? Fascist has no content any longer. It's like calling somebody a Zionist, a capitalist. They have no agreed on content. Now, Tony may have his definition of what's a fascist, his definition of what's a Zionist, his definition of what's an imperialist. He may have his definition. The problem is, Tony, probably only around 2 of your comrades at most agree with you on that definition. And then what? You silence everybody who disagrees with your definition of who's a fascist, your definition of who's a Zionist. You silence all of them. You silence all of them in the name of what? You're all-knowing. You're infallible. Your definition is, by virtue of it being your definition, it's the definition. Leaving aside everything else, the sheer presumption, what John Stuart Mill called the presumption of infallibility, by which he meant the presumption, not that you think you're right. Of course, we all think we're right. The presumption of infallibility is when, and Mill puts it in italics, which is unusual for him. He doesn't usually use italics. He uses the force of his own words, but he puts it in italics. He says the presumption of infallibility is when you decide for others what's true and what's not true. So when Tony describes a person X as a fascist, person Y as a Zionist, sure, it's within his right. He has the right to define it as he sees it. That's not the problem. The problem is Tony deciding for others. That is to say, A is a fascist, B is a Zionist, and therefore A and B shouldn't have the right to speak. Why? Because I, Tony Greenstein, have determined they're fascists. That's not how free speech proceeds. It's not how you find truth. It's a formula for just pure authoritarianism, pure dictatorship. It's frankly a ghastly formula. Having lived enough of the 20th century and its consequences, I feel very confident in saying those sorts of formulas are awful, not just because of the repression that inevitably results, not just because of the hypocrisy that inevitably results in public when you say no free speech for fascists, but free speech for me, I'm a communist, which is just the reverse of what liberals used to say. There was the famous article by this ex-Marxist named Sidney Hook. He said, the article was entitled, Heresy Yes, Conspiracy No. It was a famous article in the 1950s against the communists. It meant you're allowed to be a heretic, that is, completely disagree with received wisdom, but you can't be a conspiratorialist. You can't be part of a conspiracy. And at the time, there was the International Communist Conspiracy, as it was so called. And so communists did not have the right to free speech because they weren't just heretics, which is permissible, they were part of a conspiracy. So now Tony says it's the fascists who are part of this conspiracy, and so they shouldn't have the right to free speech. He's using the same argument that was used against the communists in the 1950s. And so you have this huge problem of being a hypocrite when you present that position in public. The other tradition is you let people speak, you take risks in letting people speak because maybe they have something of interest to say. Maybe you learn something from them. So you take the risk up until the danger is posed of violent forms of violence which cross the line from speech to conduct or speech to action. And so you take the risk. Now you might say, why should you take that risk? They're fascists. Well, I say, A, I don't know what a fascist is. So I don't want people silencing everybody because they believe anyone who disagrees with them is a fascist. And B, I want to take the chance that I might learn something of use short of that person engaging in violent activity. Now, of course, the obvious answer to that is, why should we wait till the last minute? And that was the whole history of US free speech jurisprudence. There was one tendency that said, it was called the bad tendency school. The bad tendency school is the Tony Greenstein school. The bad tendency school basically says, we already know how evil fascism is. I've studied fascism. I know about Hitler. I know about the Nazi Holocaust. We already know how evil it is. So why wait until the last minute, that is just short of violence? Why wait until the last minute to suppress them? That's the bad tendency. The bad tendency can just be called, let's nip them in the bud tendency. That's Tony. Let's crush them before they might grow and expand. And then we know the Holocaust is right around the corner. And the other school of thought says, yeah, maybe they're a bad tendency. I'm not going to dispute that. But you know what? People with bad tendencies also have interesting things to say. And if we're concerned about rational thought, rational argument, we should allow for the maximum expression of speech so that we can winnow out the wheat from the chaff, what's useful from what's not useful. And I think if you're committed not to free speech in the abstract, not to free speech in the abstract, but if you're committed to truth and rational argument as prerequisites for creating, constructing, and building a more sane world, truth as a prerequisite for building, constructing a more sane world, then there's a very strong argument for letting the speech continue until and unless it crosses that line. It takes a risk, but not taking the risk, the, so to speak, nip it in the bud theory, to my thinking, is a much bigger problem, a much bigger danger. It has nothing to do with me being a bourgeois Democrat. What do these stupid expressions mean? They're just so contentless. They're so hollow, as if putting me in that category somehow diminishes me as a radical or a revolutionary or as a leftist. Dear Tony, I paid my price. There's many a communist who's securely ensconced in academia. I lost my job 15 years ago. I never worked another day in my life. I don't care. I don't give a flying fig what idiotic, stupid, ignorant, pig-headed label you pin on me. I'm committed to truth, first of all, as a value that I value. I value truth. But beyond that, I'm a person of the left. And I don't believe you can create a rational, reasonable, sane world if you don't allow for the prerequisite, namely free speech, to figure out and find out what's true, what's not. So, as Rosa Luxemburg says, to clear a rational path into that so far mist-filled future that we're all trying to find our way to.